Well, hello everyone. Welcome to World at War Comics. My next special guest is Mr. Kyle Higgins, creator, writer of Radiant Black. Of course, you've done all kinds of awesome stuff with Batman, Nightwing. 15 years in the industry. You've accomplished a lot, my friend. It's great to have you on. Big fan of your work.
Oh, thanks so much. So nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. Well, a lot of news has been dropping Radiant Black, but
Mhm.
before we jump into that, Kyle, I would love to know a little bit more where the passion for storytelling came. Like, what part of your life did you realize you loved telling stories? And was there one person in your life that really encouraged that aspect of storytelling?
It's an interesting question. I wouldn't say there's one thing. No, I mean it's something I've loved kind of for as long as I can remember. I mean, I really fell in love with movies and ultimately comic books as well. And I think any form of storytelling is something that has really resonated for me, and it's what I knew I wanted to do kind of from a very kind of young age, even if I wasn't fully aware of it for, a little while. But I was making little short films from the time I was about seven years old with my dad and my sister. And so, yeah, it's just kind of something I've always done in one way, or one shape, one form or another. Yeah.
That's awesome. And then do you remember like your first story and have you been able to implement maybe not the exact story, but the theme of that story in anything that
Mhm.
you've done professionally?
No, I don't. No. I
Yeah.
mean, I wrote stuff when I was really young, whether it was like little stories for school, for classes, or for like the little short films that we used to make. But I mean, the first like big, I mean, I don't want to say real, but the first s significant thing I wrote would have probably been, I guess, The League, which became the base. It was my college thesis film about a superhero labor union in 1960 Chicago, and so that film ended up becoming the the inspiration for the series Cowl that we
Yeah.
we did 10 years ago, and it's now part of the Massiveverse. That actually started as a short story I wrote to get into Chapman University, into the film program. And so, I circled back on it a few years later as the inspiration for the or for what was going to become my thesis film. And now, we're literally working on the last issue of our miniseries, Cowl
Yeah.
1964, like right now. So it's like it's been with me for basically 20 years at this point. I've been doing things in that world. So
That's awesome. Do you
yeah.
did you ever think as you were writing that first iteration of that story that it eventually would become something that was published like that? Was that always the intention, or did you think it would die once you got into university?
Um, I don't remember. I don't know that yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I think I'd had the idea probably a year earlier and decided to try to sit down and like write it as either a short story, or I don't think I would have been trying to write it as a comic book at that stage. It might have been like as a short film. I think that's what it was. I was going to write it as like a short film, and very quickly realized like I don't really know enough about this concept, like just the way the world kind of works. And again, it's like dealing with like, you know, superhero labor unions and just labor unions in general. Like I was like, I was like 20 years old and was like, oh, this sounds better than well, it sounded, I thought it sounded like it was going to be more doable than it ended up being, because the second you sit down and you realize like, oh, I don't actually know how the world works um,
Yeah.
enough to feel comfortable writing a story about a topic like that, much less than like a superhero version of it. Um, but then when I wrote it as the short to get into Chapman, I really liked it was a very limited scope, kind of. It was more like a moment in time. Was the short was kind of designed as a short story, and so when I decided to circle back to it, Then, of course, the hope was that we would do more with it one day. And we had some opportunities over the years. It opened a ton of doors for me. The finished film as a director in LA. I was really young. I got a lot of attention and signed at a big talent agency and management company very quickly out of college, and then was going up for like big movies. And um, there were a lot of opportunities that I wasn't really able to capitalize on because I was like 23, and I didn't, everyone was waiting for me to bring a feature script in that I wanted to make. And I was like, I don't really know how to do that. And so the comics career kind of happened at the same time. And so that then became more the focus, but also there was always the hope, that we would be able to do more with the league. And eventually we were. We did it at Image, like I said,
Mhm.
and then that ended up opening up some doors a second time for like TV, and there were some offers, and we ended up walking away from them because they weren't the right fit. They were kind of more interested in the biggest, most significant one ended up being more interested in the property than it was in us being involved in adapting the property. And, that's fine. I get it. But it wasn't a deal that I wanted to make. And because it was a series at Image and it was based on, the college film where we own everything in both iterations, we were in a position where we could walk away from it since it wasn't on the terms that we wanted to be operating under.
Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Was that transition from film to comics difficult, easy? Was it expected, or was it kind of a surprise?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's ongoing. Like no matter what discipline you start in, anytime you work in a different discipline, it's kind of like learning another language where I feel like learning that first or that second language. I say this as someone who's not fluent in anything other than, I mean, barely English. I speak just enough Spanish to get like lost in Mexico, but not enough to get home. Uh, I took like 4 years in high school and college, and I don't remember enough of it. But when you talk to people who are multilingual, they'll talk about how like once you learn one language, it ends up becoming easier to learn, another language and then another, and you start to see patterns and commonalities and even some words that have crossed over. But just how some languages conjugate verbs and things like that can be similar. Spanish and Italian have some similarities in that way. Um, and so with writing or any sort of storytelling like that, I feel like once you figure out how working in another discipline, initially it's like when I was starting to do comics, it was like trying to speak Spanish where you're not thinking in the language, you're translating. So it's like, well, what's the word for library? So you're thinking it in English and then translating. So similarly, it's like I would start my scripts for comics, or like outlines, it'd be like writing it like I was thinking about it as a film, and then I'd have to go in and actually do the mechanical work of figuring out like, okay, how would this break across pages? Whereas now I can think in both, like when I'm writing screenplays, like I'm thinking in that form and not only style, but structure. And then I'm writing comics, like not only am I thinking in the issue by issue kind of structure, but like I'm able to think down to like the kind of page by page and where beats will happen on certain pages, where the big page turn reveals will be, things like that. So you just get better at it the more you do it, like anything. Um, but it is ongoing for sure, because just being able to speak another language doesn't mean you're fluent in it, and you doesn't even mean you're a long way from being eloquent in it. And so I think as a storyteller, you're constantly chasing eloquence in that way. And how do I how do I take advantage of the different tools, in this case, everything from structure to page turns to dialogue to efficiency of dialogue. How do I how do I work with those tools in a way that is both efficient but evocative, and they're working for me as opposed to I'm fighting against them? And I think you're constantly looking at and figuring out and assessing other writers' work, like how do you get how do you do more? And that's just an ongoing process for every creative.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting, and I never heard that explained that way, but it makes perfect sense. So you're still writing screenplays, as well as comic
Yep.
books. What is the mindset difference between a screenplay and writing out a comic book, and how do you manage that?
What do you mean by mindset?
Like, is there a different mindset on how you attack a screenplay as opposed to a storyline within a comic book where, you're
Hmm.
limited to pages? Your story probably has to be very concise. You have front, middle, end in 24 pages, whereas a screenplay
Hmm.
is a little bit more drawn out, I would assume. I don't write screenplays, but like, is it
Sure.
quite difficult?
Well, I don't think they're a one-to-one at all. So it's like, the it depends on if you're talking about a comic in the form of like an ongoing series. Are you talking about it as a mini series? Are you talking about it as an original graphic novel? And those are all different structures, and they have different strengths to them, and different kind of requirements. And I would say that like an ongoing series is kind of the closest thing to like a TV show where you're writing something that is intended to keep going, but every chapter needs to be narratively satisfying, not only on its own, but as a part of a larger whole. If you're writing like a limited series or a mini series as a comic, or even an arc of something, it has a little bit more similarity to something like a feature where you're in some ways you could almost break it down into like sequences of a feature, if you were to think about it that rigidly as a one-to-one. But I think that's actually where a lot of that's what I mean by translation. That's where a lot of the some of the, I would say, almost the kind of the pitfalls come from, because if you're designing something, if you're writing something as a comic that you're originally intending as, say, like a film, they're going to work differently. Just because a comic has visuals and dialogue doesn't mean that it's essentially just storyboards for a movie. Like, they're completely different mediums, they're different art forms, they're different ways of telling stories. And I think that like the approach on something like a film versus a comic, I would, it's a much more, it's almost like I'm very obsessive about kind of structure,
Mhm.
and not even necessarily with any sort of like formula or save the cat stuff or anything like that. Like, I don't do any of that. Um, but I understand structural and narrative moves. And so I think like in particular in a feature, the way that I try to tackle it, and I struggled for a long time writing features because it's just such a big piece of work. It's so many pages. And so I really have to think of it in break it into sequences. So I'll tend to break a feature into about there's an approach called like the eight sequence approach, where your first act tends to be two sequences. Your second act is four sequences with a midpoint in between sequence, actually four and five, con taking into consideration that your first act is also two sequences. And then your third act is going to be sequences seven and eight. And so within that, they're kind of like mini movies, and there are different goals, um, and through lines in each one of those sequences, if you were to break it down kind of that rigidly.
Mhm.
Um, I think though that like ultimately the biggest kind of fundamental difference between writing a comic and writing a movie from a story approach standpoint is very similar to what you would see the difference between like a show and a film, where in a film the character like the story is going to be ultimately about the main character overcoming kind of whatever fatal flaw they have. It's the one time you can tell that story. Whereas in a feature or in a show, they kind of never overcome that, save for maybe the final episode or episodes, because that ends up being the engine for um, the series and for drama and for the perception of growth. But the kind of like core stuff doesn't tend to change about a character until there's no more story to tell. Whereas in a movie, it ends up kind of being a condensed down version of an arc. And that's, I'm being really, really general there. Like, it's
Yeah.
not like there are plenty of movies where the moves are small and it's not overcoming kind of fatal flaw stuff. But, it's just one way to think of it. It's like the film, I think of films as like, well, what's the one story as opposed to if you start from a concept in a comic, like you're gonna have to find something like Radiant Black. We're up to technically issue 31, numbering wise, but we've done like 36 issues
Yeah.
with the Catalyst War and our two books at the same time releases. And so you're coming up with, you know, of those 36 issues, like probably 30 different stories,
Yeah.
kind of iterating off of the central concept. Whereas in a film, I tend to approach is like, well, what's the one story I can tell here? Because it's probably the only story you're going to tell, and so you approach it differently in your way in, and what you're prioritizing does tend to naturally kind of sort itself out a little differently than you would approach it in a comic, since you are more limited in both kind of I don't know time and scope, I
Hmm.
guess.
Yeah. Over time, since you've been doing both, is there a preference or do you enjoy one more than the other? Or are there just two different aspects of writing that you enjoy?
Well, screenplays pay better. I'll say
Okay,
that.
there you go.
Or they can. They
That plays a
can.
role, right? That plays a big role.
No,
Absolutely.
no. It's. I wouldn't say I enjoy one more than the other. I enjoy different aspects of both, um, and I dislike different aspects of both. In comics, it's really great. It's almost like kind of like mainlining story where. Um, sorry, one second.
You're good. Yeah.
Um, Comics in some ways, I heard Grant Morrison describe it one time as like you're like mainlining story or mainlining narrative, and
Mhm.
it's I used this phrase in an interview earlier this week where I was talking about like how computer coders like they you hear the term like coding down to the metal, where your goal is writing code that like is so efficient and clean it can be run right, you know, right at the kind of motherboard level, the circuit board level. I'm not a computer engineer, so I apologize if I'm getting terms wrong, but like the code can run basically like as efficiently as possible without having to go through all sorts of different um, you know interpretations or processing devices, etc. And comics is kind of like that too, where it's like
Mhm.
it's just you and a small group of people making stuff very quickly. And there's I love that. Like there's such a nimbleness, especially in creator-owned comics, um, to being able to kind of spin up a new book or a new issue like really quickly and finishing it and getting it out there and from the time that you're sending a book at a place like Image, you're sending a book, you're turning a book in essentially 5 weeks before it hits stands, and you're
Okay.
hitting print on, or maybe it's 6 weeks, it's something like that. You're hitting print on it essentially 3 weeks before it comes out. So that's a really fast turnaround time. Whereas anything film related takes forever. Um, and the likelihood that anything you write is ever actually going to get made is, I feel it's like, it's kind of like an inverse relationship. Like the further along it gets, the less likely it is to actually get made. So, I have some friends who are big feature writers, and it's like, they've made more money than I'll ever see in my life, but nothing they've written has been made. So that's a source of frustration for them that's different than my frustrations, as a creator working in a medium that, and an industry where, it's not always great to the creatives in it. Um, so,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I really just enjoy and pride myself on trying to take full advantage of whatever medium I'm working in
Mhm.
and doing things narratively that can kind of only be done in that medium. So, it doesn't matter where I'm kind of working in. It's more about what I'm working on. And like there's a screenplay, there's a feature I'm writing right now that, is a really, really cool project. Um, it's something that, like, yeah, I mean, you could do a version of it as a comic, but I think it works much better as a film. And similarly, like, there have been comics over the years where it's like I feel like this actually just works best as a comic rather than, um, any sort of potential, adapted version.
Yeah. Now, when you started with Radiant Black, was that always
Mhm.
intended to be a comic, or did it kind of turn into a comic?
In the form that it is now, yeah, it was always intended to be a comic. Um, there was um, there was a project that I was working on when I was wrapping up my time on Power Rangers that, was kind of, for a brief moment, I was intending to try to do as like a live action digital series.
Mhm.
I had been working on something, with the late Jason David Frank, that was going to be, set in the world of the books in this kind of like, darker future, kind of alt timeline called the coin. It was the world of the coinless.
Mm.
And it was something that Saban was really, really excited about. And then Hasbro bought the brand, and everything ended up getting put on hold, and then ultimately, didn't move forward. And so as the writing was on the wall there, I kind of stepped back and was starting to think about, like, well, what's something like just kind of like spiritually in the ballpark, like very different, but is there anything I could build out of as an original thing, like as a live action digital series? And so I had this thing. The working title was like, initially I was just calling it, the Vanguard. It's actually the pitch that's in the Radiant Black, hardcover,
Ah,
and it was like this kind of like post-tech dystopia where it's 200 plus years after the world has been, saved, air quotes. And by whatever means that was, it involved a miniature black hole, or these miniature black holes that we were calling radiants. And that quickly kind of turned into the name Radiant Black. Um, but it was like these cities that were like it was like Blade Runner cities in a Mad Max world where like you're hiring like coyotes to like usher you from one city to the next, and so we were following a coyote kind of doing things like that, and then it turns out like he's actually the son of the despot from 200 some years ago who turned after saving the world and everything. So it was something that was like, I mean, like I said, the pitch is actually in the hardcover for
Mhm.
year one of Radiant Black, but very quickly it was like, I'm not gonna like, no one's gonna buy this. Like, no one's gonna make. Who makes digital series, by the way? And like a digital series of an original idea where it's gonna cost a ton of money to do. Like, there's no real path here. And so I decided like to figure out a version of the concept that might work as a comic. And so that was it was going to be like a 6 issue thing that I was doing. And then Eric Stevenson, the publisher of Image, asked me if I'd ever thought about building an original creator-owned superhero series. And I was like, well, I would kill to do something like that, but I figured there was no market for something like that. And he very much thought there could be. And he told me to think of it as like optimistic sci-fi. And so I decided like, well, if I'm going to do this, like I think I know how to do it. And there had been a pitch I was working on for DC that I never even ended up pitching. But it involved this aspect of like a like late 20s something being laid off from Wayne Enterprises and having to move back in with his parents in the Gotham suburbs. And that little kind of nugget was something that I always really liked because it
Yeah.
felt very right now. And like I've friends who have had to move back home, and so it's like, okay, this is something that feels relatable and specific, not necessarily specific to my generation, but certainly applicable to my generation right now these days. And
Absolutely.
so I brought the name and the iconography of Radiant Black from that Vanguard project, and I brought the setup from that DC pitch, and then I set it in my hometown and built out what I like to call it, like a very contemporary superhero series about two disillusioned millennials navigating failed dreams and credit card debt with the help of
Yes.
miniature black holes and existential giant robots. So no, it was never intended to be anything other than a comic, though its points of origin and inspiration do come from, kind of 1 degree removed, I guess, from comics, like stuff that I had been thinking about initially in a very, very different form, intended to be working in a different medium.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, now we know Nathan's backstory.
Well, which part? Oh, so I guess sort
Yeah.
of, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. At least the first couple of issues, right? Moving back,
Hmm.
feeling like, yeah. I mean, I have a 27-year-old who is back home after the pandemic for the kind of the same reasons, right? So I do think that is a very relatable aspect of the last 5 years for sure.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into some of the news that's been coming out, Kyle, on
Mhm.
Radiant Black. A lot of really cool news. Obviously, the war is over. We're ready to go into a brand new arc. But there's a lot of fun things that I've heard you kind of talking about. You want to walk us through some
Mhm.
of the things that fans can expect from Radiant Black moving forward with all I like we got I was just looking, I had it next to me, but I might have it downstairs. I should have brought it up here, but I had the it's like a one shot that you provided for free to stores.
Oh,
There it
this
is.
one?
Yeah, I was trying to look for it. I have it here somewhere, but what a great like if you've missed the first 31 issues, 32 issues, this is you need to go to your store right now and look for this. Like if you're not familiar with Radiant Black, it's like a concise overview of everything that you've missed up into this new arc, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, I mean it's basically a 16-page free comic that we ship to stores that works with all pre-existing art, but it's narration that walks readers through the big moves of the first 3 years of Radiant Black, culminating with the Catalyst War and this insane two timelines at once story that we told utilizing two different books coming out concurrently. Um, if you can't find it at your local store, We actually set up. It's available online for free as well. So if you go to radiant.black/catch-up as one word, not the condiment, but CATCHUP. So radiant.black/catch-up. You can read it for free. And then we also have like a cool like sale going on right now just to help people like get caught up if they want to read any of the volumes. We've done 6 volumes of collected editions so far, trade paperbacks, and we're selling them all right now on our site, like through us, like you're buying them from the creators for like 15% off.
Wow.
And then if you're not a subscriber already to the Black Market newsletter that we have, which is my little creative collective Black Market Narrative, it's our studio. That's what we do the books through. Um, if you sign up, it's for free. We send you a one-time 10% off code, and it's stackable, so you could actually get all the trades or any of the trades for 25% off right now. And again, just trying to make this as accessible as possible as we now enter into what we're calling our rebuild era, where we're back, we're on time, we're monthly, we're down to one book a month with Radiant Black, and we're kicking off this not only this new era for the book, but this new era for Marshall, who is now the permanent Radiant Black as a result of the not only the end of the Catalyst War, but the fan vote that we did to determine the fate of Radiant Black at the start of the Catalyst War. And so he's moved to Chicago, and having seen a timeline where everything went horribly wrong and he did some horrible things, he is determined here to not let that happen and to become both a better hero and a better person. And so he's trying to level up quite a bit here. But that's just as the city and the world starts to really make some moves with regards to their own kind of feelings about what happened in the war and now the aftermath of it and what they feel and think about Radiant Black, much less the other characters, the other Radiant characters, and the proliferation of all these weapons, this alien technology that charges by being near any of the miniature black holes. There's something that sparks that we're kind of describing as a populist protection movement. And there's all sorts of ideas and theories about what actually happened during the Catalyst War and what this Radiant Black might actually be after here and how it could be very, very dark for all of us. And so, um, you know, this is as the city is also trying to figure out how to literally rebuild. And there's still like the carcass of giant, the giant 110-foot tall colossals like laying in the middle of State Street that they haven't been able to, dismantle to this point. So Marshall may want to level up, but first he's going to have to keep the bottom from falling out. So,
Yeah.
and then this issue not only kicks off the rebuild era for Radiant Black, but also for the Massiveverse in general. And so, for those who don't know, the Massiveverse is our interconnected, creator-owned superhero universe at Image that started with Radiant Black, but includes Rogue Sun and Inferno Girl Red and the Dead Lucky and our superhero, our big multimedia murder mystery, No One, that just wrapped up last year. And we're now making a feature film of that's also in universe with the book. And so Rogue Sun enters its new era with issue number 25, which has its FOC and then release set 2 weeks after Radiant Black. And that brings in um, a new Rogue Sun, Dylan's half sister Ari.
Yeah.
Rogue Sun's a book that I love,
Yeah.
that I hope more people will pick up and give it a shot. It's kind of
Absolutely.
like a supernatural. It's like a supernatural Batman Beyond with like a shitty dead dad who haunts
Yeah.
the suit. And so every time that this kid becomes Rogue Sun, his estranged dead father, who he didn't know because he left when the kid was like 2, um, Dylan can see the ghost of his dead father, and so he's got to like actually build something of a relationship with this man he's hated all of his life, as he tries to figure out how to become a superhero and also like he's a teenager, like figure out life
Yeah.
and grow as a person and everything, and all while keeping like all these like supernatural forces from like destroying New Orleans essentially. So, but ultimately, the book's like really kind of a metaphor for, being the child of divorce and what that looks like. So,
Yeah, and that's with Ryan still writing.
yeah. So Ryan Parrott, it's
Yeah,
co-created by Ryan Parrott and Abel.
yeah,
And so they're back. Nick Cotton, who's an old friend of Ryan's and a frequent collaborator, he's joined to co-write with Ryan. Um, and yeah, that all kicks off with March's Rogue Sun 25.
that's so cool, man. I'm so happy for you getting to this point. We were talking before we hit the record button how rare it is to see any run, outside of the big two where those runs, even they start them over again, even though they kind of have the number in the background, right? But it's really
Yeah.
on the indie side very rare anymore that we see runs get past 12, 24 issues. Um, but yeah, you've been able to create a world with others that have kind of gone against that. Can you kind of share what your thoughts are behind that and what's going on within the industry? Why don't we see more longer runs? Do you think it's just the consumer, the change in the consumer and their attention span? Like, there's all kinds of theories out there, and I don't want to be negative or anything, but there's a lot of theories out there. I'm wondering what you think as
Mhm.
a creator, what it might be. Yeah.
Um, I think that, I mean, look, there's a lot of reasons for it. I think primarily right now, it's a really challenging time for the industry and the market. And to your point, I've been talking about this quite a bit on podcasts the last couple weeks and interviews. Like I would even say it's pretty rare to see a big two book in the 30s numbering wise. Um, I think that like it's obvious and understandable why you reboot a book and start with a new number one. You get a big boost there, or you did. It's diminishing returns though. And I was there, I was writing um, for DC during the New 52, and I wrote Nightwing and Deathstroke. And so that was like the first time DC had really rebooted in such a significant way in like 75 years. I mean, at the very least, you could say since Crisis, which was in 85,
80s,
84,
yeah,
somewhere in there.
85, yeah.
So it was a really big deal, and you do create a really nice access point for new readers. But if you keep doing it, I actually think that in some ways, Marvel and DC have kind of broken the illusion of like continuity and things mattering because you've just rebooted so many times. It's harder to figure out kind of where things slot.
Mhm.
Um, but I understand why you do it. I think as far as like books, especially on the independent side, not being able to do it, I think it's twofold. One, there's a lot of short form stuff out right now. There's a lot of like 6 issues and done stuff, or maybe 12 issues and done. There are a lot of publishers. There's a lot of books. So there's so much stuff for retailers to keep track of and to be across. And there's a lot of it's very tumultuous right now with regards to like retailers also having to navigate all these different distributors. And obviously everything going on with Diamond right now is a really big kind of wrinkle in things. Diamond also had a over the last, however many years, um, they've had a lot of publishers added into the catalog as well. And so retailers now needing to keep track of a whole host more products is something that makes it hard for them to really be across everything. And when you have that many books, and I'm not saying any of the books are bad or anything like that,
Yeah,
there are amazing books coming out, but there's only so much bandwidth
yeah.
from both an attention span standpoint as well as a financial standpoint, and not everything is sustainable. And so I think what also has started to happen to that point is that, it's just not financially viable for creators, especially on the creator-owned side, to keep a series running past 6 issues or 12 issues. You look at something like Local Man, which I adore. Tim Seeley
Tony Fleece.
and Tony Fleece are two very good friends of mine, and go read the letters column at the end of their final issue.
Yeah.
Um, and I know for a fact that like the numbers weren't what they hoped they would be on that title. And I think that, I mean, that's also why we have been pushing so hard the last few weeks with Radiant Black and Rogue Sun and our kind of like, our rebuild here is creating jumping on points, not only for readers and maybe old readers who want to come back or hopefully new readers who want to check us out, but also for retailers to give like a surge point of like, hey, we're not that we ever lost dedication, but we're refocused, we're rededicated, like we're here, we're going to be communicating better, our stuff's going to be on time and monthly. Because I think that ultimately, for the health of the industry, I do think we need more long running series. And those are the things that become sustainable. And I don't mean just sustainable from the standpoint of like the book being able to keep going. I mean sustainable from the standpoint of like growing readers, growing a community, like, and also growing, consistent buyers. And so I think with how many short form things there are, some things make sense to do short, and that's great. And like I'm not saying anyone shouldn't be doing that,
Yeah.
but I think that if we can find a way to support, long running stuff more and not just get into this kind of mindset that like, well, above issue 20, book sells what it sells.
Yeah.
And I know stores there are some stores that like they only order books. They'll only order Radiant Black for their pull box subscribers. So they're not even ordering it for the shelf. And it's like, well, then how does anyone find it? And their argument would be, well, it sells what it sells. And so there's only so much bandwidth, there's only so much shelf space. And it's like, right, but if you're not putting it out, how will anyone find it? There's no hope then. And so how do we change that? And I think that like, I think something Robert has always been great at in his long running series is creating those, spikes of interest, but also accessibility.
Hmm.
And I think that's where we're at right now with our stuff as well.
Yeah. One of the really cool things that DC has recently done is they gone to those 9.99, these right here. And
Uh-huh.
even though I have a lot of these comics in floppy form, I do travel a lot for work, and I take one of
Hmm.
these every time I go because it's a full arc of something, right? Or
Hmm.
it's a full run of somebody's run, depending on the size of it. Have you thought about maybe taking Radiant Black and seeing if you can reformat it and that kind of?
Hmm.
Because I saw again, the numbers are a little fuzzy too because they're not shared like they used to be years past, where you know
Right.
exactly like who is the number one this week and through 10 and whatnot. But
Hmm.
Barnes and Noble and some of those type of accounts do release their top graphic novels for both manga and comics. And
Hmm.
DC for the first time outside of Watchmen, which is always in the top five, like I think three or four of their titles for a long time were in the top 10,
Hmm.
which was I was so excited to see comics in that because as a comic fan, I certainly I I certainly don't want anything to happen to the industry, which
Hmm.
I don't think it will. I think it'll always be here in some format, but I really love going to the comic
Hmm.
book shop on a Wednesday and getting my floppies. And so I'd
Right.
love to see this because I'm hoping that this draws in readers that won't necessarily go to a comic shop, but they'll read this and like, well, how do I get more? And that will drive them to a comic book
Hmm.
shop, hopefully. Like maybe I'm wishing a little much, but
There,
I'm hoping so.
yeah, there's different schools of thought on that. I think that you're talking about kind of two different markets there. You're talking
Okay.
about the book market and people that read in collected editions, and you're talking about then monthly readers in the direct market. I also think like the stuff you're talking about are like those tend to be kind of more evergreen stuff. Like there are runs in there, but it's stuff that has been around for a while and has been successful before this format. Like, let me ask you, what's the price point on that? Is it 9.99?
9.99 on all of them, except for a
Uh-huh.
couple. There was a couple that
Uh-huh.
will bump up to like 11.99 depending on how thick it
Right.
is.
And how many pages are in that?
I can tell you right now, the Wonder Woman Earth one is, it doesn't have page numbers, but I mean, it's thick. It's got to be a,
Right. Can you, it doesn't say on page
it,
one in the Bible,
oh, let's see.
It looks like it is 376 pages.
Yeah, it's thick.
Okay. Just to give you a point of reference,
Sure.
Radiant Black Volume 1 is 5 issues long. Each
Oh,
issue is 5 issues long. Each issue is at least 22 pages.
mhm,
Some were up to 28 pages. You know what? I can actually tell you right now because I have the trade right here. So
mhm,
Radiant Black Volume 1 is actually it's uh it's 180, well, story-wise, it's 100 and about 168 pages, okay? We sell that for 9.99.
mhm.
Volume 2, which is the same length, is like I think 14.99 or 15.99. Um, Doing a 376 page collection for 9.99 doesn't work for us, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, understood.
When you look at something like um, even something like Invincible,
Mhm,
where it's at the stage where it has come out as the monthly comics over the years. It came out as the trade paperbacks. It then came out as the collection of 12 hardcovers. And then it started coming out as the compendium editions, right? The gap in between those releases
mhm.
is staggered by quite a bit because otherwise you're cannibalizing your sales on the formats where, the book is hopefully growing and making the creators money.
Mhm.
All of those 9.99 editions are super cool. But those are also like, I mean, how many times have those stories been collected? Court of Owls has been collected in
Tons.
5 different formats by
Yeah,
by this point.
yeah, yeah.
Watchmen, same thing. So I think it's interesting, but I unfortunately don't think the answer is as simple as like,
Mhm.
making the format smaller, a la something like manga, and denser. Um, I think it makes for an awesome product. Like, don't get me wrong.
Sure,
I
yeah,
just, I know what the numbers look like, and financially,
yeah.
if you've got Batman in it, it is gonna do a lot better and make a
Understood.
lot of other things possible than if it's like an original creator-owned thing. That said, I wouldn't rule it out for us. It just wouldn't be any time in the future. Like, people ask us all the time if we're going to do an omnibus or compendium, and it's like that doesn't make sense for that just for the realities of like how finances work in comics and in the collected edition market and everything. Um, but down the line, one day, um, many years from now, sure, like you could find a way to do a soft cover, like real big compendium. But even that, like you're not going to do an omnibus of like all of the titles as one thing. Like, an omnibus still has a finite number of pages in it.
Yeah.
So it's only so many collections that you're getting into that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, either way, what you and the rest of the team have accomplished up to this point is, I mean, you're at the cream of the crop, I think, when it comes to indie creations, just because we don't see them get as far. So I feel like there's a lot of success as a reader. There is. I just talking to other people. I mean, Radiant Black has got to be one of the more popular indie comics out right now. And like I told you, I was so happy to see this bad boy right here. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous, and it's the first 12 issues, and it has some extras in it, which is really cool. But yeah, I'm so happy. And I know on a prior podcast, people were asking for obviously animated because of what happened with Invincible. And if I thought of any other comic, man, Radiant Black would be perfect for that same format. But you did a really fine job of like breaking down what the investment is on something like that is absolutely ridiculous, right? So, but maybe one day, right?
Well, we did maybe. I mean, it's got to be the right situation. Like
Yeah.
we did a 5.5 minute
Hmm.
secret animated short film for the book,
Yeah.
tied to issue 15. But as far as like, yeah, like a full animated series or something like that, you know, on average, you're looking at like it's like $8 to $10 million to do essentially like an 8 episode thing.
Yeah.
And if you were to raise that money on your own somehow and just make it on your own and then try to sell it to a place like a Netflix or an Amazon or wherever else, um, that's a really interesting model because then you're in the driver's seat and it's essentially like the finished work, the finished show becomes a licensed property, like a licensing deal to a platform like that, like something like Arcane
Yeah.
is, or but if you're trying to sell the project to a Netflix or an Amazon up front, which is really most of the time, I mean, I don't know a lot of people that can just go find $8 to $10 million independently to fund an animated show or series. So you are at the, you know, you're beholden to like one of these platforms saying yes. Well, right now in this day and age, like they want all rights on everything. And so, you know, and when's the last time you saw Netflix put out a physical media release of something? Like, doesn't happen. So if they decide they don't want the show on their platform anymore, or they want to use it as a tax write-off, I mean, like HBO Max did on all those things, like there's nothing you can do about it. And on the one hand, the argument would be, yes, but if you get a show, if you do a show on a Netflix or an Amazon, like that platform is so massive that, especially if it works, if people are aware of it, like it ends up selling so many books for you. But on the flip side, like how many rights do you have to give up in
Yeah.
order to go do a show? So like I know for a fact like Netflix would want theatrical rights, they would want live action rights, they want everything. Because they know that to make something is then going to turn it into something that just increases the perceptible value of the entire thing. Um, so it's something we're interested in for sure, but it's got to be the right situation with the right partners. And it's not going to be something where we're ever going to just sell it or option it.
Yeah.
Like, we've been around the block too many times, all of us. Like, Ryan Parrott is, you know, he has a career in TV as well, and he's working on some really big things right now. Um, and it's like, yeah, we're not gonna
Yeah.
we're not gonna do that. We did get some offers on Radiant Black before the writer's strike.
Hmm.
And I was partnered with someone really good that we were gonna co-show run if it were to move forward. But we ultimately we turned them down because they weren't the right fit.
Yeah. 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 Understood. Understood. Yeah, I feel like I don't know, giving away the rights to your creation is I don't know how someone lets go, especially when you've done as much as you've done to build out the world. That's got to be one of the hardest
Yeah.
decisions as a creator to come to that point, right? Where if you wanted to explode, you might have to give up quite a bit to make that happen. And I'm not sure how that plays out in the long run, right?
Well, I think it depends on what you want. And
Hmm.
I know I remember one time James Tynan and I had a James is one of my oldest friends in comics. We came up together in at DC and I remember one time we were talking about uh, rights and certain companies and you know how they what they want as far as like ownership of certain media rights and things like that. And I was kind of saying this where it's like, why would you part with that? Why would you give that up? And I remember James telling me, he's like, well, you know, Kyle, he's like, not everyone wants to go make a TV show or a film. And I stopped and realized, like, yeah, you're 100% right. The irony is now where James is at, it's like, you know, I gave him a hard time a few years
Yeah.
ago. I was like, how does that, do you still agree with that? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. He's done a pretty
so,
good job with Tiny Onion now. So it's a little bit different, right?
yes. Yeah. But like, you know, there are certain books and certain creators where I think the conversation is twofold. I think there's a saying in like in professional sports about like be who you can afford to be. You know, like not everything is equal, and if you're if you're LeBron James or Steph Curry, like you can afford to be whoever,
Yeah.
because you're so valuable in your field. Now, I'm not saying like be an asshole or anything like that. Like that's not excusable, but I think there are slightly different, I don't want to say rules, but life's not fair. And I think in the case of like things like that, comics and film or TV or adaptations, like my whole thing is like, is it an equitable exchange? So I think you have to look at where you're at in your career, what's important to you, and what you are getting out of whatever deal you're signing. And if that to you, what you're gaining from that, or what you think you're gaining, or what it's potentially opening doors for, if you think that is equitably worth what you are giving up or parting with. And so I think it is a case by case and an individual by individual basis. But I think you just have to really be honest with yourself. And for some creators, like when you're starting out, like just getting published somewhere, you might be willing to sign what you either know or what's worse, don't know, is a really bad deal. But, you know, equitably, what is it getting you? Like, is it credentialing you in some way? Is that publisher worth the credentialing that you feel you're gaining by, signing that contract? Um, there are pluses and minuses to all those things, and I think like, for years, like I wasn't willing to option any of my work, unless I was the one that was going to be, if not involved doing it, actually doing it, adapting it myself or directing it, etc. And I mean, you can Google how many of my things have been turned into anything. Zero.
Yeah.
And so you go, okay, well, would my career on that front be further along? And people would tell me that it would be as things were going on. If I just let go of this one, what it could spark. But I wasn't willing to do it. And I don't regret it at all. I have friends who have sold things and they've gone on to be turned into even bigger things. And, those friends might be set money wise off of the first thing, or maybe they weren't.
Yeah.
But they're not involved in it anymore, you know? And I think that's for me, like I've just watched that happen too many times over the years where, or you option or sell the rights and then it's stuck and you can't get it back. So, again, it's like now kind of where I'm at career wise, like I'm in a position where, um, well, I never felt like I had to. I never felt like I had to give up, like sell something or anything like that. But now, kind of even less so. Like it's just not something I'm interested in unless it's the right fit, and it's with the right partners.
Yeah. I mean, good for you. Congratulations. I mean, I think a place where a lot of creators would like to get to. And
Of
I
course,
think
yeah,
it just takes time, right? And experience.
yeah. It's time. It's time and a ton of work and just a dedication to your craft and your medium um and the good news is like most people doing comics are doing it because they love comics, and so dedication is not a problem
Yeah.
in this industry. I mean, it is just for some people, I guess, but most of us are doing this because we love it, and so wanting to only make the best things you can possibly make, and to do it at the highest level that you can actually do it at is that's just kind of what we all signed up for.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's awesome, Kyle, man. I can just tell you from a fan perspective, really enjoy your writing, your style, love Black Radiant. I'm a big fan of Ryan as well. I've gotten to meet him a couple times. I love Rogue Sun. It's another
Yeah.
banger title, and I'm so excited for hopefully new readers to experience Radiant Black. I think it deserves all the readership. It's an awesome story, incredible, character development, and a lot of relatability throughout the entire 3 years that you've been at this. So congratulations on everything. I wish you nothing but the best moving forward. Cannot wait for this new arc where people could kind of jump in for the first time and not have to worry about all the history as much. And I tell you, they're going to go back eventually, anyways, if they get into it because it is that good.
Totally.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else you're kind of working on that you wanted to share with everybody that you wanted to make sure got out there? Or is it just Radiant Black so far related?
No, I mean, I work on a lot of things right now. I'm stretched pretty thin, to be honest, but like, we do Radiant Black and we do Rogue Sun. Infernal Girl Red book two is coming out later this spring, early summer. We're kind of looking at right now. The book's done. Like, we're dealing with getting it printed right now, for our Kickstarter backers. And then I do the book Moon Man with Kid Cudi.
Yeah.
We just had our second, our kind of
Art.
start
Yeah.
issue six and issue seven, which are two flashback issues set in the um, in the era of the accident and what happened and everything with these astronauts and their mission to the moon that went awry. Um, and then, yeah, I've two other books that came out last year that I'm really proud of. That I actually think the best way to read them is in collected edition. The first is called No One, which
Oh,
is our true crime multimedia murder mystery. And so it follows this character, focuses on this character named No One, who's like this digital hacktivist who doxes these four very corrupt people in Pittsburgh, and then nothing happens, and so someone else in the city starts killing them, and it sparks this like ideological killing movement built on accountability. And so the no one ends up becoming like a physical presence, and he's kind of our Batman type character. And there are these reporters in the book who are talked into starting a podcast chronicling their investigation into not only no one's identity, but this larger movement that's going on and who this killer is. And so we made that podcast for every issue as a scripted audio series with Rachel Lee Cook and Patton Oswalt and Lauren Lester, who's the voice of Nightwing and Robin from Batman the Animated Series. He voices No One for us, and
that's awesome.
Yuri
Yeah.
Lowenthal from the Spider-Man games, and Tara Platt, and Todd Stashwick, and Adam MacArthur from Jujutsu Kaisen, and Walter Jones, who's Zach from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. They all joined us in just a killer cast on this thing. And then all of the websites that exist in the book, we made those for real as well. And so you can actually go to the No One site, and if you know the right code, which you learn from the book and the podcast, like you can actually access all of the doxing files. And there's Unreal Engine videos we've done. And
It's
then at
amazing.
the end of it all, we made all the newspaper articles too. I hired a crime reporter from CNN and the Chicago Tribune to come in and
That's
write
crazy.
these with us.
Yeah.
So that at the end of it all, there's a QR code. Throughout the book, there's like 35 QR codes, like for a lot of this extra material. And at
Wow.
the end, there's a QR code that takes you to a live action trailer that we shot right before San Diego Comic-Con. And it announces that the story is continuing in a feature film that I'm directing, and Brian Buccellato and I are co-writing. So we're writing that right now. And the film is it's a true crime superhero documentary. So the intention and hope is that everyone who voiced the characters on the podcast will play them in front of camera for the documentary. And so the film will both adapt the comic and the audio series and everything and continue the story. So it's one big like multi-narrative. So that's out now in trade paperback. It's like 360 pages long. We did like 145 pages of art revisions. Like it's the best way to read it. And it has all the back matter and all the additional ancillary stuff like incorporated into it. And then the other book is called Deep Cuts, which is a 60-year spanning story that I co-wrote with my best friend Joe Clark, who is a frequent collaborator. We went to high school together. We've been working together for 20 years in different forms. Joe is an incredibly talented musician and composer. In Chicago, we grew up playing in jazz bands together, and I was a trumpet player until I was about 25. Um, and this book it takes place in six different eras of American history and jazz. And it's like I said, it spans 60 years, starting in 1917 in New Orleans all the way through 1977. And if we did our jobs right, it's something where it's a story focused on different characters. Each chapter is 48 pages long, drawn by a different illustrator. And it's really about these kind of loose connections across these years and the way that work done in one generation can inspire the next, unbeknownst to the people making it in the first place. And we were kind of really dedicated to setting out to try to like recontextualize the idea of like success and failure, especially across art and creation. And like I said, immensely proud of it. We worked on it for 5 years. We were nominated for an Eisner last year for Best Anthology. Um, so that's out in collected edition as well. It's about the same length as Nolan. It's about 360 pages or something. So those would be
Incredible.
the two big ones that I definitely want to make sure that more people, find and become aware of because I think they're. I don't think there's anything else like either of those books that has come out.
Yeah. Well, below, as you're watching this, all the links to all of that will be below to make it really easy for
Awesome.
people to get a hold of those. Kyle, I can't tell you how much I appreciate, especially short notice. I know we were kind of talking to figure a date, like, let's go. Like, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
So I really
Yeah.
appreciate you making the time. I realize how busy you are. Big fan of you, big fan of your work and the rest of the team.
Oh,
I
thank you.
can't tell you how much I appreciate you entrusting me with your story and allowing us to kind of dig into Radiant Black and all the cool stuff that's going on, and then all the extras that we talked about. And I hope that we could do this again sometime as you have more news coming out, which I'm sure for pretty soon you will.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, we'll talk again soon.
All right. Well, Kyle, have a great rest of your week. And once again, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yep.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.